Winston Churchill writing his famous 6-volume history of the war. A magnificent literary work, if I may say so. I hope that when I'm as old as Churchill, I'm still able to pour out volumes of that complexity and that magisterial quality. Winston Churchill, he wanted to publish a certain piece of evidence that he had about where the Germans got their money, where Adolf Hitler got his money in the rise to power, in that final desperate, headlong rush to the Nazi revolution in 1933, when the Germans, the Nazi party, were almost on the point of bankruptcy. Somebody put up the money for Adolf Hitler in order to ensure that he came into power. Winston Churchill knew the answer, because Winston Churchill was privately told this in a letter dated August 28, 1937, by Dr. Heinrich Brüning. Dr. Heinrich Brüning, I should tell you, those who don't know, was Adolf Hitler's predecessor as Chancellor in Germany. With a short interim government, Brüning had been the long-term German Chancellor. Hitler had overthrown him. The Nazi revolution had swept Brüning aside. Brüning, being the Prime Minister of Germany, the Chancellor, of course, knew who had financed Hitler, because his secret service, his wiretapping agencies had been listening to Hitler's telephone conversations and opening his mail. They knew where the money came from. And Brüning, when he fled to England after Hitler came to power, told Winston Churchill privately in a letter, August 28, 1937, and Churchill wanted to quote that letter in his post-war memoirs, the big 6-volume book. And Churchill's memoirs, as you know, were published by the Life magazine, serialized by Life in 1948, 49, 50, and that is why among the private papers of Life magazine's chief editor I found the letters, the ones that I'm going to quote to you now, because you won't find them in the Churchill archives, for the simple reason that if you are writing about Churchill, even if your name is William Manchester, which it isn't, thank God, you will not be given access to the private papers of Churchill. The Churchill family has put their hand on those papers and will not allow them to be seen by anybody, except for one authorized biographer, Martin Gilbert, a dedicated Zionist who is partly financed by the Jaffa Foundation, as he writes in the introduction to his Churchill biographies. So we can't get access to the Churchill papers. We've got to go everywhere else, which is what I do. I go all the way around the world working in these archives, like, as I mentioned, the archives of Life magazine in the United States. And there I found this letter, Churchill writing to Brüning saying, in August 1937, you wrote me a letter which I want to quote in my memoirs about who paid Hitler in 1933 and the years up to the Nazi revolution. And Brüning wrote back to him. Here's the letter dated February 7th, 1948, from the private files of the chief editor of Life magazine. Never published, and you're hearing it for the first time now. Brüning said he couldn't give Churchill permission to quote that letter because it was too painful, in view of everything that happened in Germany during the Third Reich, in view, of course, of the Holocaust, to have to admit this. He says, I didn't then, I do not even today, for understandable reasons, wish to reveal that from October 1928, the two largest regular contributors to the Nazi Party were the general managers of two of the largest Berlin banks, both of the Jewish faith, and one of them the leader of Zionism in Germany. Now, I don't know whether Brüning is a reliable source, and let me make that quite plain. Brüning was admittedly the Chancellor of Germany before Hitler. He had all the Secret Service methods of surveillance at his fingertips. He could find out things like this. So he was in a position to know what he's writing about, which is an important criterion on documents. As a historian, and I was taught this by Trevor Roper himself in England, as a historian, when you're looking at a document, you've got to ask yourself 3 important questions. Why has that document been written? What purpose? Because it may be a document written for spurious purposes, like, for example, a document being written in order to cover up a certain truth. Is the document genuine? Also an important question, because there are a lot of fake documents floating around, but I know how to detect them. I've got a lot of comparisons, I've got a lot of expertise in detecting fakes. I've been flooded with fakes over the last 20 years, and I don't think I've fallen victim of a single one, because you can always, if the worst comes to the worst, I've got a very good laboratory, which I rely on in the City of London, who work for the insurance industry, Hayner and Cox Limited, and they carry out the forensic tests on the paper, the black light tests, the ink, the type of typewriter used and so on, and they can tell me if a document has been faked or not. That's the second question, is the document fake? And the third important question is the man who wrote the document in a position to know what he's purporting to write about? A very important criterion. There's no use having the private diary of a street sweeper in Berlin. If you want to find out what's going on in the Chancellery in the Wilhelmstrasse, you need to have a document written by somebody in a position to know. And this document, of course, by Brüning, the letter by Brüning to Churchill, is by a man technically in a position to know. He wrote that, and he said he didn't want to reveal in 1947 that unfortunately the money which had brought Hitler into power was paid by these two Berlin banks and their general managers, about which he made that remark, which if I was to make it, of course, would be considered deeply objectionable. I'm not making it, let me emphasize that. It's being made by Dr. Heinrich Brüning himself, who died only a few years ago. You see the problems we're up against when we look at the history of the Second World War. And it's a problem which we can learn from now, because if we were being duped at the time about the leaders in the Second World War, about your own Prime Minister Mackenzie King, about the Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies, about Roosevelt, about Churchill, about Hitler and Stalin, if we were being duped at the time, and if we were being successfully lied to, and if these lies have been told to us so well that they are still now believed, even today, 50 years later, aren't we required to ask ourselves certain questions about major issues of political importance which are being turned out to us now by those modern historians, the journalists, the newspaper trade, the media men, and ask ourselves, isn't this a new embryo lie in the creation? And of course it is. Certain episodes which make me convinced that we are being lied to. We're being lied to about Libya. We're being lied to about South Africa.